Chapter Summary. Learning. Definition of learning. 5.1. Define the term learning. Learning is any relatively permanent change in behavior brought about by experience or practice and is different from maturation, which is genetically controlled. It makes your mouth water. Classical conditioning. 5.2. Identify the key elements of classical conditioning as demonstrated in Pavlov's classic experiment. Pavlov accidentally discovered the phenomenon in which one stimulus can, through pairing with another stimulus, come to produce a similar response. He called this classical conditioning. The unconditioned stimulus, UCS, is the stimulus that is naturally occurring and produces the innate or involuntary unconditioned response, UCR. Both are called unconditioned because they are not learned. The conditioned stimulus, CS, begins as a neutral stimulus, but when paired with the unconditioned stimulus, it eventually begins to elicit an involuntary and automatic behavior on its own. The response to the conditioned stimulus is called the conditioned response, CR, and both stimulus and response are learned. Pavlov paired a sound with the presentation of food to dogs and discovered several principles for classical conditioning. The neutral stimulus, NS, and UCS must be paired several times, and the CS must precede the UCS by only a few seconds. Other important aspects of classical conditioning include stimulus generalization, stimulus discrimination, extinction, spontaneous recovery, and higher order conditioning. 5.3. Apply classical conditioning to examples of phobias and taste aversions. Watson was able to demonstrate that an emotional disorder called a phobia could be learned through classical conditioning by exposing a baby to a white rat and a loud noise, producing conditioned fear of the rat in the baby. Conditioned taste aversions occur when an organism becomes nauseated sometime after eating a certain food, which then becomes aversive to the organism. Some kinds of conditioned responses are more easily learned than others because of biological preparedness. Pavlov believed that the NS became a substitute for the UCS through association in time. The cognitive perspective asserts that the CS has to provide some kind of information or expectancy about the coming of the UCS in order for conditioning to occur. What's in it for me? Operant conditioning. 5.4. Identify the contributions of Thorndike and Skinner to the concept of operant conditioning. Thorndike developed the law of effect. A response followed by a pleasurable consequence will be repeated, but a response followed by an unpleasant consequence will not be repeated. B.F. Skinner named the learning of voluntary responses operant conditioning because voluntary responses are what we use to operate in the world around us. 5.5. Differentiate between primary and secondary reinforcers and positive and negative reinforcement. Skinner developed the concept of reinforcement, the process of strengthening a response by following it with a pleasurable, rewarding consequence. A primary reinforcer is something such as food or water that satisfies a basic natural drive, whereas a secondary reinforcer is something that becomes reinforcing only after being paired with a primary reinforcer. The neural bases of both classical and operant conditioning include the anterior cingulate cortex and the nucleus accumbens, areas involved in the release of dopamine. In positive reinforcement, a response is followed by the presentation of a pleasurable stimulus, whereas in negative reinforcement, a response is followed by the removal or avoidance of an unpleasant stimulus. Shaping is the reinforcement of successive approximations to some final goal, allowing behavior to be molded from simple behavior already present in the organism. Extinction, generalization and discrimination, and spontaneous recovery also occur in operant conditioning. 5.6. Identify the 4 schedules of reinforcement. Continuous reinforcement occurs when each and every correct response is followed by a reinforcer. Partial reinforcement, in which only some correct responses are followed by reinforcement, is much more resistant to extinction. This is called the partial reinforcement effect. In a fixed interval schedule of reinforcement, at least one correct response must be made within a set interval of time to obtain reinforcement. In a variable interval schedule of reinforcement, reinforcement follows the first correct response made after an interval of time that changes for each reinforcement opportunity. In a fixed ratio schedule of reinforcement, a certain number of responses is required before reinforcement is given. In a variable ratio schedule of reinforcement, a varying number of responses is required to obtain reinforcement. 5.7. Identify the effect that punishment has on behavior. Punishment is any event or stimulus that, when following a response, makes that response less likely to happen again. In punishment by application, a response is followed by the application or experiencing of an unpleasant stimulus, such as a spanking. In punishment by removal, a response is followed by the removal of some pleasurable stimulus, such as taking away a child's toy for misbehavior. A person who uses aggressive punishment, such as spanking, can act as a model for aggressive behavior. This will increase aggressive behavior in the one being punished, which is an undesirable response. Punishment of both kinds normally has only a temporary effect on behavior. Punishment can be made more effective by making it immediate and consistent, and by pairing punishment of the undesirable behavior with reinforcement of the desirable one. 5.8. Explain the concepts of discriminant stimuli, extinction, generalization, and spontaneous recovery as they relate to operant conditioning. Discriminative stimuli are cues, such as a flashing light on a police car or a sign on a door that says open, which provide information about what response to make in order to obtain reinforcement. Shaping, extinction, generalization and discrimination, and spontaneous recovery are other concepts in operant conditioning. Instinctive drift is the tendency for an animal that is being trained by operant conditioning to revert to instinctive patterns of behavior rather than maintaining the trained behavior. 5.9. Describe how operant conditioning is used to change animal and human behavior. Operant conditioning can be used in many settings on both animals and people to change or modify behavior. This use is termed behavior modification and includes the use of reinforcement and shaping to alter behavior. Token economies are a type of behavior modification in which secondary reinforcers, or tokens are used. Applied Behavior Analysis, ABA, is the modern version of behavior modification and makes use of functional analysis and behavioral techniques to change human behavior. Neurofeedback is a modified version of biofeedback in which a person learns to modify the activity of his or her brain. Cognitive Learning Theory 5.10. Explain the concept of latent learning. Cognitive learning theory states that learning requires cognition, or the influence of an organism's thought processes. Tolman found that rats that were allowed to wander in a maze but were not reinforced still showed evidence of having learned the maze once reinforcement became possible. He termed this hidden learning latent learning, a form of cognitive learning. 5.11. Explain how Köhler's studies demonstrated that animals can learn by insight. Köhler found evidence of insight, the sudden perception of the relationships among elements of a problem, in chimpanzees. 5.12. Summarize Seligman's studies on learned helplessness. Seligman found that dogs that had been placed in an inescapable situation failed to try to escape when it became possible to do so, remaining in the painful situation as if helpless to leave. Seligman called this phenomenon learned helplessness and found parallels between learned helplessness and depression. Observational Learning 5.13. Describe the process of observational learning. Observational learning is acquired by watching others perform or model certain actions. Bandura's famous Bobo doll experiment demonstrated that young children will imitate the aggressive actions of a model, even when there is no reinforcement for doing so. 5.14. List the 4 elements of observational learning. Bandura determined that 4 elements needed to be present for observational learning to occur: attention, memory, imitation, and desire. Applying psychology to everyday life. Conditioning in the real world. 5.15. Describe an example of conditioning in the real world. The chime of an incoming message can act as a conditioned stimulus for a pleasurable response.